It's a special kind of failure to end up back in your childhood bedroom at 22. The walls are still the same shade of pale lilac I'd begged for when I was 14, a color that now feels like an accusation. The failure wasn't dramatic, just a quiet fizzling out of money and motivation, leaving me washed up on the shores of my parents' suburban home with a useless partial degree and the hollowed-out feeling of a ship run aground. I was in the middle of this specific flavor of self-pity, peeling a damp sports bra from my skin after a pointless, punishing run, when the door creaked open. I didn't have time to cover myself. I just froze, half-naked, a pale and startled animal caught in the headlights of someone else's arrival. It was Julianne. My mother's friend, Julianne. She was a fixture in my life the way a mountain is a fixture on the horizon, always there, solid, beautiful, and impossibly distant. She held a stack of folded towels, her expression unreadable. The normal thing to do would have been to gasp, to slam the door, to apologize profusely and turn away. She did none of these things. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rainstorm, met mine. They didn't rake over my body with appraisal or disgust. They simply rested. It was a gaze that took in the goosebumps on my arms, the faint silver lines of stretch marks on my hips, the vulnerable curve of my spine. It lasted only 3 seconds, maybe 4, but time stretched and warped until the silence in the room was a physical weight. In that silence, I felt more seen than I had in years. Not exposed, but witnessed. Then, a flicker of something regret? Surprise crossed her face. "Sorry, Alara," she said, her voice a low contralto that had always seemed too rich for my mother's chattering kitchen. "Your mom said to put these in here." She placed the towels on my dresser with a slow, deliberate motion, never quite looking at me again, but not rushing to escape either. Then she was gone, closing the door softly behind her, leaving me with the scent of her perfume, something like sandalwood and ozone, and the vibrating, humming stillness of a moment that had irrevocably broken the rules. I sank onto my bed, the discarded bra still clutched in my hand, and for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about my failure. I was thinking about the way she looked at me. My mother, in a flurry of panicked phone calls and overpacked luggage, had to leave for a week to take care of my grandmother. "Julian will check on you," she'd announced, as if I were a delicate houseplant and not a grown woman stewing in her own inadequacy. The announcement filled me with a cocktail of dread and a fizzing, shameful excitement. Julianne in my house. Without the buffer of my mother's constant, nervous energy. The first day, she arrived with groceries. Not junk food or pity meals, but fresh vegetables, a whole chicken, a bag of expensive coffee beans. She moved through our kitchen with an easy, proprietary grace, as if the space made more sense with her in it. "I figured we could cook," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Her presence was a quiet occupation. She didn't fill the silence with chatter. She let it settle, comfortable and deep. We worked side by side, the clink of knives on the cutting board and the sizzle of onions in the pan the only sounds between us. I found myself watching her hands. They were strong, capable, with short, clean nails and a faint tracery of blue veins beneath the skin. When she showed me how to properly joint the chicken, her fingers brushed against mine. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. I pulled back as if burned. She didn't acknowledge it, her focus remaining entirely on the task, but I saw the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. We were building a new language in that kitchen, one made of shared tasks and close proximity, of things left unsaid that were screamingly loud in the space between our bodies. The house, which had felt like a cage of my own making, began to transform. Its corners softened, its shadows held the promise of her arrival. I started listening for the sound of her car in the driveway, my heart a stupid, fluttering bird against my ribs. This was dangerous territory, a landscape of unspoken things, and I was walking into it with my eyes wide open, drawn to the quiet storm I saw brewing in her. The coffee became our ritual. Every morning, she would arrive around 9, letting herself in with the key my mother had insisted she take. I'd already be awake, having tossed and turned for hours, my thoughts a tangled mess of her. The aroma of her coffee, rich and dark, would fill the house before she did. She'd find me at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm mug of my own instant brew. Without a word, she would take my cup, empty it into the sink, and replace it with one filled with the coffee she'd made in our French press, a device I never knew we owned until she unearthed it from a back cupboard. "No one should have to drink that powdered misery," she'd said the first time, her lips quirking in a ghost of a smile. We would sit in the morning light, the steam from our cups rising between us like a transient veil. Our conversations were sparse, orbiting safe, impersonal topics: the book she was reading, a movie I had seen, the relentless summer heat. But the real dialogue was happening underneath. It was in the way she'd watch me over the rim of her mug, her gaze steady and unnervingly perceptive. It was in the way I'd find myself memorizing the small details of her face, the single silver strand at her temple, the faint scar that bisected her left eyebrow, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was thinking. I was drowning, and I knew it. Drowning in the quiet domesticity of it all, in the potent fantasy of this being normal, of this being ours. One morning, I asked her about the scar. I hadn't meant to. The question just slipped out. She paused, her cup halfway to her lips. Her expression shuddered for a brief second. "An argument with a rose bush when I was 10, she said, her tone light, dismissive. But her eyes told a different story. For a split second, I saw a flicker of a deep, old pain, a wound that had nothing to do with gardening. It was a crack in the formidable armor, a glimpse of the woman hidden beneath the carefully constructed composure. And it made me want to know everything." One afternoon, she found me staring at a blank canvas propped on an easel in the spare room. I'd hauled my art supplies home from college, another collection of relics from a life I'd failed to launch. I hadn't touched a brush in months. The desire was gone, replaced by a hollow echo of what used to be my passion. "You paint." Julianne's voice came from the doorway, soft, so as not to startle me. I shrugged, a gesture meant to convey a nonchalance I didn't feel. "I used to," the words tasted like ash in my mouth. She walked into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look at me, but at the canvas, at the tubes of paint lying dormant in their box. She picked up a tube of cerulean blue, turning it over in her hands. "My wife was a painter," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. I knew she was a widow. My mother had mentioned it years ago, a tragic, hushed story about a car accident, but Julianne never, ever spoke of her. The word wife hung in the air between us, shimmering with a significance that made my breath catch. "She would get lost in it for hours," Julianne continued, her gaze distant, fixed on a memory I couldn't see. She said it was the only way she could make the world quiet. She placed the tube of paint back in the box, her fingers gentle, as if handling something sacred. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, and the shared space of our unspoken attraction was suddenly filled with this new, profound layer of shared understanding. She saw the artist in me, the one I thought was dead and buried. And in her, I saw a grief so vast and deep it was a silent, integral part of her. We were two lonely people, orbiting each other in a quiet house, recognizing the same ache in one another's eyes. The forbidden nature of my feelings felt less like a transgression and more like a lifeline. She wasn't just my mother's friend anymore. She was the only person who saw the parts of me I kept hidden, even from myself. The guilt began to eat at me. It was a constant, low-grade fever that spiked whenever my mother called. Her cheerful, oblivious voice on the other end of the line was like a knife twisting in my gut. "Is Julianne taking good care of you?" "She's such a saint, isn't she?" I would murmur my assent, my throat tight, the lie a toxic lump I couldn't swallow. I started to pull back. I'd make excuses to be out of the house when I knew she was coming. I'd answer her questions with monosyllables, my eyes fixed on the floor. I was trying to build a wall, brick by painful brick, to put the proper distance back between us. I needed to remember who she was, my mother's best friend, a woman 20 years my senior, a person who belonged to a different world, a world I was not a part of. She noticed, of course. Julianne noticed everything. But she didn't push. She simply adapted to my new distance with a quiet, sad patience that was far more devastating than any confrontation would have been. She'd leave the coffee she'd made on the counter for me. She'd text to say she'd dropped off a few things, that I should call if I needed anything. Each act of kindness was a gentle tap against my poorly constructed wall, threatening to bring the whole thing tumbling down. One evening, she called. "Your mother asked me to check on the fuse box. The lights are flickering in her study." It was a simple, practical request. An excuse. We both knew it. I let her in, the tension in the hallway a thick, suffocating blanket. While she worked, I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to read, the words on the page blurring into meaningless shapes. The house was too quiet, the space between us charged with everything we refused to say. I was fighting a war with myself, and I was losing. Every instinct screamed at me to close the distance, to go to her, to confess everything. But the fear, the shame, the image of my mother's trusting face held me captive. I was trapped in a cage of my own making, and the only person with the key was standing in the other room. That night, the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle summer shower, it was a violent, biblical deluge. Rain hammered against the roof, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. The lights, which had been flickering all evening, finally gave up with a pathetic sizzle, plunging the house into a sudden, profound darkness. I gasped, a stupid, childish sound in the overwhelming noise of the storm. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that split second, I saw her silhouette in the kitchen doorway. "Alara." Her voice was calm, a steady anchor in the chaos. "I'm here," I managed to say, my own voice trembling. I could hear her moving toward me, her steps sure-footed in the dark. Then, the house groaned as a massive gust of wind hit it, and a deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations. I flinched violently, a choked cry escaping my lips. And then her hand was on my arm. Her touch was firm, grounding. It wasn't tentative or accidental, it was deliberate. A clear, unequivocal message. "I am here. You are safe." She led me to the living room, and by the intermittent flashes of lightning, we found the emergency candles my mother kept on the mantelpiece. Julian lit them, and the room was filled with a soft, flickering glow that threw dancing shadows on the walls. The storm outside raged on, a perfect pathetic fallacy for the tempest inside me. The power outage had stripped away all pretense, all routine. We were just two people in a dark house, surrounded by a storm. She sat on the sofa, not too close, but not far either, leaving the choice to me. I sat down, the space between us feeling both like a vast chasm and a single, indrawn breath. The walls I had so carefully constructed were gone, washed away by the rain and the dark. For a long time, we just sat and listened to the storm. The candlelight softened the sharp angles of her face, making her look younger, more vulnerable. The formidable composure she usually wore had slipped, replaced by a quiet weariness. Finally, I broke the silence. My voice was small, almost lost in the sound of the rain. "I feel so lost," I whispered. It was a pathetic, simple confession, but it felt like I'd torn open my own chest and showed her the hollow space inside. She didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She just turned her head and looked at me, her moss-green eyes reflecting the candlelight. "I know," she said. 2 words. But in them, I heard a universe of empathy. I heard the echo of her own grief, her own loneliness. I heard an acceptance so complete it made me ache. The conversation that followed was halting, fragmented. We spoke of my abandoned art, of her late wife, of the crushing weight of expectation, and the quiet terror of an empty house. We didn't talk around the issue between us anymore. We talked through it, using the stories of our separate lives to map the common ground where we now stood. Emboldened by the darkness and her quiet understanding, I finally said it. That day, I started, my heart hammering against my ribs. "In my room." You didn't look away. Julianne was very still. The flame of the nearest candle danced in her eyes. She held my gaze, her own unwavering. "No," she said, her voice low and thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "I didn't. I had to know." "Why?" The question hung in the charged air between us. She took a breath, a slow, deliberate inhale. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Because for the first time in a very long time, she said, I saw something that made me want to stay, and that was it. The dam broke. All the tension, the longing, the fear, and the hope that had been building for weeks crested and then shattered, leaving behind a raw, beautiful, terrifying truth. She moved first. It was a slow, deliberate shift across the space on the sofa that had separated us. Her knee brushed against mine. The contact was electric, a current that seemed to arc through my entire body, silencing the storm outside and amplifying the one within. She lifted her hand, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw, her touch feather-light and yet impossibly heavy. I leaned into her palm, my eyes fluttering shut. This was surrender. A complete and total abdication of the fight I had been waging against myself. When I opened my eyes, her face was inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in her irises, could feel the warmth of her breath on my skin. Alara, she whispered, my name a question and a prayer. I didn't answer with words. I closed the remaining distance between us. The kiss wasn't fiery or demanding. It was slow, searching, and deeply tender. It tasted of coffee and rain and weeks of unspoken longing. It was a conversation we couldn't have with words, a confession of shared loneliness, a promise of solace. Her hand moved from my jaw to the back of my neck, her fingers tangling in my hair, holding me there, grounding me. My own hands came up to frame her face, my thumbs stroking the sharp line of her cheekbones. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before. We broke apart, resting our foreheads together, breathing the same air. The candlelight flickered, casting our joined shadows onto the wall behind us. Nothing in my life had ever felt so right, so inevitable. The guilt, the fear of my mother, the 20-year age gap, all of it faded into insignificance, silenced by the profound, irrefutable truth of her lips on mine, of her hand in my hair. This wasn't a mistake. It was a recognition. It was finding the other half of a song I didn't even know I was singing. In the shelter of the storm, in the intimacy of the candlelight, I had finally stopped drowning. We woke to a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind the clean, earthy smell of wet soil and the gentle drip of water from the eaves. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, painting stripes of gold across the floor and across Julianne's bare shoulder. She was still asleep, her arm thrown over my waist, her breathing a slow, even rhythm against my back. I lay there for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams, feeling the solid weight of her against me. A fragile, tentative peace settled in my chest. There was no panic, no morning after regret. There was only a quiet, humming sense of rightness. Eventually, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at me, a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze before it softened into a small, wry smile. Morning, she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. The domesticity of the moment was so potent it almost hurt. This was what I had been craving, this simple, uncomplicated intimacy. We didn't talk about what happened, not right away. We didn't need to. Instead, we moved to the kitchen, the familiar territory now transformed. We made coffee, our bodies moving around each other in a new, easy choreography. Her hand brushed my lower back as she reached for the mugs. I leaned against her for a moment longer than necessary while waiting for the water to boil. These were small things, tiny gestures, but they felt monumental. They were the building blocks of a new reality. As we sat at the table, sipping our coffee in the bright morning light, the silence was different. It wasn't fraught with tension anymore. It was full, comfortable, and complete. The future was still a vast, unknown territory. My mother would be home in 2 days. The world, with all its rules and judgments, was waiting just outside the door. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the settled quiet that follows a storm, a quiet filled with potential. Julianne had left a few hours ago, a lingering kiss at the door, her only promise. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I wandered into the spare room and stood before the blank canvas. For the first time in months, it didn't look like an accusation. It looked like an invitation. I picked up the tube of cerulean blue she had held, the plastic still seeming to hold the warmth of her touch. I squeezed a dollop onto my palette, the color vibrant and alive. My hand, when I picked up the brush, was steady. I didn't know what I was going to paint. It didn't matter. The important thing was the act itself, the willingness to start again, to make a mark, to create something new out of the emptiness. My mother would be home soon. There would be difficult conversations, complications, potential heartbreak. The path forward was not simple or easy. But as I touched the brush to the canvas, making that first bold, blue stroke, I wasn't afraid. Julianne hadn't fixed me. She hadn't solved my problems or erased my failures. She had simply done something far more profound. She had seen me. She had looked at the mess of my life, at the raw, unfinished parts of me, and she hadn't turned away. She had stayed. And in doing so, she had given me back to myself. At the kitchen table, her coffee mug sat next to mine, unwashed. I ran my thumb over the ceramic lip, a small smile touching my own. Whatever happened next, we would face it. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something new had begun to grow.